greatest number of people. That is what a constitution must be. And having set the objective of the constitution, you then frame a constitution to achieve that objective.
Because we really do have a race problem. Those divisions are real. We see it in our politics, we see it in our trade union. We see that they take the divisions with them. Look at where people live in this US. You have enclaves in the Bronx and in Richmond Hill and in Brooklyn. They're taking the division with them.
Women are dying in the streets, and we have a government pontificating running around campaigning for women's vote. No women should vote in this election coming up unless there is something done to the legislation as Magistrate Kim is advocating.
That voices like ours that are not in the political trench fighting it out, voices like ours should become stronger. One of the things about the Caribbean is that we have never had one discourse. Bass will know the days of the New World and the Old World and the radical left and so on. What we had was this concourse of ideas, which I think in the early days of independence pushed us in a certain direction. We've got to move back to that point of having these multiple discourses.
Okay, gentlemen, you could begin.
All right. Good evening, viewers, and welcome to the first of what will now be a monthly program with yours truly as your host/facilitator. This program will be focusing particularly on economic issues in Guyana. This public discussion forum, I'm of the view, plays an integral role to inform and educate the populace, and more than that, public intelligible discourses in some way, shape, or form do help to shape or influence national policies. The intent of the discussions and these programs are not just designed to foster discussions only for the sake of discussions, but the common man or the ordinary citizen to understand how economic policies and decisions affect their lives. More importantly, to have intelligible discussions that can produce a variety of ways in which these issues can be addressed. Having said that, I now want to introduce our guest for tonight. Unfortunately, one of our guests, Mr. Derrick Arjune, will join us a bit shortly, who's having some technical issues. And he is a community activist. And our second guest for tonight, we have no stranger to us, Mr. Dhanraj Singh, right? Executive Director of the Guyana Budget and Policy Institute. So, since it's just me and you for now, Dhanraj, let's start by you. First of all, what is your position on the topic of cash transfer? But before I just want to qualify the topic for tonight, which is, we're talking about cash transfer, but I want to contextualize it in the sense to talk about the pros and cons, and will this really help to alleviate poverty or widen income inequality? So, good evening once again, and over to Dhanraj.
All right, Joel. Well, good evening to everybody. And Joel, thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate it. So you know, this issue of cash transfer has been in the media for quite some time. And I first must say it's a good debate. It's a healthy one. It's a debate that I think we as citizens ought to have. That said, we owe it to ourselves to also make sure that we're filtering the information that we're getting about cash transfer, and make sure that as a citizen, we're taking an informed position on this issue. And so with that in mind, my position, I have documented this in the media, and I have documented this on GBPI website clearly, that before I say I'm in favor of or I am not in favor of, I'm going to take a step back and ask the question which I think you mentioned just now. What is the purpose? What is the intent of a program like this? Because the purpose for which we're using the program will then inform my position on whether I agree or I think there is a better approach. And as I think you rightfully contextualized, if we're considering the program within the context of a poverty reduction strategy or an approach to address poverty reduction and inequality, my position is I think it's not the best program. It's not the best policy. There are better ways to get those outcomes. Definitely within the context of Guyana and our political economy situation and our economic situation, there are better options than that. So I want to be clear. I'm sure we're going to get into a lot of the details about how the program works and the good and the bad about it. But I do not support a broad-based cash transfer program. I think there's scope for a very limited, and I'll explain what I mean later on to the program by a limited versions of it. But there are better ways to address poverty and inequality than a cash transfer program, to put it bluntly.
All right. So before we get into the better ways and so on, would you like to tell us a little bit more as to why you don't think it's the best method? So
to begin with, the economic literature is very clear on this, right? Let's address the issue of using cash transfer as a poverty reduction strategy. All right. One of the arguments that is advanced, or perhaps the biggest argument that is advanced for cash transfer, is that, well, it allows people, it gives them some income power to buy the goods and the services that they currently are not able to afford, or they do not have the money to, right? And so on the surface, that argument seems rational. There are clearly some people in society who may not be having 3 meals per day. There are clearly some families who might not be affording proper nutrition for all their kids. So I get that part. But the bigger portion of this argument is there's an assumption behind of that argument. And the assumption is that what we have is a demand problem. And so if you start with the approach of assuming that you have a demand problem, then clearly giving people more money, giving people cash at the end of the month should address that problem. But the reality is that we have much more of a supply problem, an institutional problem, access problem, than a demand problem. And so throwing money at a problem that requires a supply side policy response is not going to address it. And I'll give you an example what this might look like. Oftentimes you will hear people jump into the argument and they will say, well, a lot of places in Africa, they're doing cash transfers and some research has been done, and it shows that students are able to increase their enrollment for school and all of that. Now, without getting into the technicalities of it, the problem with that analysis right off the face is you can't compare poverty in Guyana with poverty in Africa or poverty in Asia. While there might be broad similarities, you have to pay attention to the root cause of these issues. So let me give you an example. Quality of education. When students go to school right now, many of these average families, people who are struggling to make ends meet at the end of the day, their child will come home and say, Mom or Dad, we have a book list from the school. And this is a first former in high school. The parent will see a book list with 15 books long. All right? They will come home and the student will tell them, we are 6 months out from CXC and we have not yet completed half of the syllabus. All right? And I can go on. They can go to school and they have a research to do, but they have to come home and go to a private cafe to pay X amount of dollars just to be on the internet for 2 hours. Those issues are not going to be solved by cutting people a check with $5,000 at the end of the month or $10,000 at the end of the month. What you need is proper investment in the education system. That would benefit everybody. So no child should be coming home and say to the parent, they have a book list that is going to cost $100,000 to buy. No parent children should have to come home and say, Mom or Dad, I can't do my assignment because I need $1,000 to go and spend 2 hours at an internet cafe. And they certainly should not be able to come home and say, well, I am 6 months out from CXC exams and my teacher we're not close to completing the CXC syllabus. So what you need is to address the fundamental problems in the education system, improve the quality of the education, improve access. When you look at some of the rural communities in Guyana and particularly the hinterland communities, Children are going to school. Can you imagine this? Children are going to school in canoes. 3 of them are riding a bicycle. I mean, this is 2019 we're talking about. So there are many other aspects of the education system, and I'm just using the education as one of the examples that we should be looking at when we're dealing with, if we want to benefit everybody and make sure that everybody help them in the long run to lift themselves out of poverty, than just basically cutting a check at the end of the month. And I want to be clear, I am not saying that cutting a check at the end of the month might not help Tom down the road, or it might not help Jill down the road. But what I'm saying is that when you take everything together, the system together, over a period of time, the fundamental problems that keep people in poverty, cash transfer is not going to address them. And perhaps this is the second other thing that I should point out, instead of going too long to hand you back the mic, is one of the assumptions that is also being made when to advance this cash transfer argument is you're paying people with the hope that they will change their behavior, right? In some communities, you might find that, okay, children are not going to school sufficiently, or they're not going and get a medical checkup from a doctor. And so you assume that, okay, hey, with this cash transfer, I'm going to put a conditionality to it. And the conditionality is that you're going to go to school. You're going to enroll to go to school, right? So the hope is that with the incentive that you're providing as cash, people will change their behavior. The problem with that thesis is that you can't pay people to change their behavior. Yes, it might help. It might nudge them over the line. It might help a few people. But for a complete economy or a community or a society, there is no guarantee that people will change their behavior. Maybe they'll change it for a time, but there's no guarantee there's be a long-term change. So again, if the objective is to address poverty, there are better ways to do this than cutting a check and give to people. And like I said, recall that I said I support a very limited, and we can talk about that later on, very limited.
All right. I want to back up a little bit on one of your points. You said you started off by saying that the issue of cash transfer is more of a demand problem, while acknowledging that there is a supply problem, an institutional problem. I want you to explain for the layman to understand what you mean by demand problem, because demand problem is a vague term. So what exactly you mean by demand problem for the layman to understand in the context of cash transfer, on the notion that this initiative would alleviate poverty?
Okay. So again, so my apologies. Maybe that's one of the economic jargons that pops out. But when we say a demand side problem, it means that we are assuming that the problem is that people can't afford certain things, or they can't afford to buy certain things, or there is a shortage of income that people can use, the disposable income that people can use to buy some buy goods and services that would improve their welfare. All right. Now, on the surface, this sounds reasonable. You ask an average person, what's the problem? They might tell you, I want to do this, or I want to do this, but I don't have the money. Or I want to do that and I don't have the money. But let me ask you a question. When people show up now at the public hospital and they don't have aspirin and Panadol, is that because the person did not show up at the hospital? Or is that because the hospital don't have a Panadol or any whatever the tablet is to give to them? It's if you show up at the hospital and you don't have the medication that you're there for, that's not a shortage of a demand. That's a shortage of supply, meaning that it is not there. So instead of picking winners and choosers and saying, okay, here are the people that we're going to try to target and we're just going to give them money, or we're going to give everybody a check at the end of the year, none of that would put more medications in the hospital. None of that would somehow make teachers who are not getting a good work environment or a good decent pay None of that will tell the teachers to say, well, I'm just going to stay because at the end of the year, I'm going to get a stipend or a cash transfer from the government. None of that is likely to make people remain in the teaching profession or remain in the medical profession. So when I use the term and say it assumes it's a demand problem, I'm basically saying that one of the underlying assumptions of cash transfer is that the supply is there, the service or the good is available. People just can't go and get it. So maybe let me give you another example. If we give every household who has a child in secondary school right now $10,000 more a month, $50 a month, yes? Does that mean that that child now have access to the internet and a good book in school, in the school library? No. It doesn't. So again, when we treat the problem as though everything in the entire problem, and I want to be clear, there's a thin line that you have to cross here, yes? Because if you go to the poor, the average family, and you say, take for example a family who can't afford 3 meals per day. Yes, then naturally if you cut a check and give to that family, they will be able to buy another meal. There's no question with that. But beyond the basic necessities of life, providing the basic necessities of life alone is not going to address poverty in the long term. 10 years from now, or 50 years from now, when the oil money come and it's gone, or whichever money we're using, when that come and gone, that is not going to fix the problem that you have. A few people might escape through the poverty trap, and that's good. But for the larger majority, you have not built an economy that can work for everybody and that can prevent people in the first place from falling through the cracks or being left on the sideline. There's a system, the public service is good, the public provisions and opportunities are good. There's economic opportunities, so people who go to school, they come out and they get a training, they can get a job, they can make a life for themselves.
All right, I understand the point you make. You made a very important point with the example you give. If you give a household, if you give a child or you give a family whatever amount of money, it doesn't mean that they will have access to internet, for example, because there are some communities in the hinterland, for example, that don't have proper these sorts of access to ICT. So if you want to come out of poverty and you want to improve your lifestyle and standard of living, you don't have these facilities, how will you improve it in a particular geographic location? Now, I want to pause a bit to ask, is our other guests in the studio?
Yes, I'm here. Good evening, everyone.
Hi, good evening.
I don't exactly know where two of you were, so I hesitate to intervene or to state my position. But if it's fine, I can go ahead and join the conversation.
No. Okay, I wasn't aware that you're online already. So, permit me, I was looking for your video to pop up. Permit me to welcome you once again officially to Globespan. And I believe this is your first time at Globespan, if I'm not mistaken. Right?
No, it's not. I had the privilege of appearing on Globespan about a month ago. And I believe, if I remember correctly, Mr. Dhanraj Singh, who's your other guest, was the moderator.
Yeah.
Oh yes, I did. I did meet Mr. Derrick. It's a pleasure to have you.
Okay.
Certainly is for me too.
Okay, well, tonight I'm the moderator, but I'm playing a dual role, not just moderator, commentator as well, so more or less sort of facilitator. But I'll allow you two gentlemen first to expound on the issues, and then I'll comment later on the show. So let me just bring you up to speed what we were discussing. So we're talking about cash transfer in the context of whether it's the pros and cons, and whether it's a good initiative to alleviate poverty or poverty reduction. And I started off by asking Mr. Dhanraj Singh what is his position, and his position is that he's not in support of the idea, for the reason being that he believed that there are other alternatives for that purpose of alleviating poverty. And while we were waiting on you, he was more or less defending his reasons and his rationale why he thinks so. So, in all fairness to you, so now I'll ask you the same question in the context of the theme for tonight. What is your position on cash transfer? And do you support it or not? Are you in favor of this initiative or not, and why? Over to you, Mr. Arjune.
I say unhesitantly that I am in support of cash transfers. I believe that they can and have in fact alleviated poverty. While it is not the cure-all for poverty, it is one of the effective tools of alleviating poverty around the world. The data supports that conclusion, and there's no reason to believe that it will not do the same for Guyana. Indeed, the data worldwide shows that cash transfers, whether they're conditional or unconditional, have had a noticeable impact on poverty. If you look at Latin America, and some studies have looked at about 19 countries in Latin America, for instance, the EASA study, and that study concluded that but for cash transfers, we would have had a greater amount of poverty in those 19 countries studied. And in fact, the World Bank has said without doubt that cash transfers are a useful tool in assisting families throughout the world. Now, we have cash transfers not only in developing countries, but we have cash transfers in developed countries. Indeed, in the OECD countries, the Organization of Economic Development, which sees the most developed countries in the world, and also Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, the data shows that those countries have effectively used cash transfers, albeit conditional cash transfers, to help those in need. So this argument that is being put forward by Mr. Singh is not supported by the evidence. And indeed, as we look around the world, cash transfers, whether outright or conditional, are becoming more and more a part of the tools used to alleviate poverty. I have some statistics here, which I can throw out, but on a general level, the thinking is that we need to help people on a conditional basis, giving them money and ask them to do certain things. And in some cases, as in Uganda, Kenya, money given to families directly have helped them in many aspects, psychological, social, creating jobs for themselves, education, and also going to the doctor. So to take the position that cash transfers are not useful is unsupported by the evidence. With respect to Guyana, we're a poor country. We have a lot of poverty, and many of our people need help, direct help. We can fashion programs in which we ask them to attend schools or to have their children in schools, provide them skills, and also provide them opportunities to get involved in entrepreneurial activity. We can also give them money outright because there are many persons in Guyana. And I keep in mind that we are not provided in Guyana with household income data. I just saw that they're about to conduct a survey on that score. But one of the problems in Guyana is that we're starved of useful data about economic well-being of our families. It's more like a general statement about how people live and what they're living on. But suffice it to say, many of us come in contact with Guyanese who don't know where the next meal is coming from, who don't have shoes, who can't purchase transportation for their children to go to school, who cannot pay for a doctor, and it's unfortunate that we have the public hospital who can provide services. Sometimes those services are inadequate. But the fact of the matter is that our people are poor. And again, referring to what is happening in other countries, if we were to give them money directly, they can use that money to help themselves. I have an article here which was written by a columnist in the New York Times. And one of the things he said is that what was found by giving people money is that they knew how to use it. And one of my arguments against those who don't want to use cash transfers is that they think they know more than the poor as to how to use the money. We have organizations in the world who are beginning to increase cash transfers, direct cash transfers. For instance, direct funding is involved in giving more money to people around the world. They're globalizing their projects in many countries so that the poor or those in need get the money directly rather than going through organizations. So again, I say, this claim that the poor needs to be taken or led so that they don't misuse this money is misplaced. It is born of an elitist attitude, and I don't mean to accuse my worthy opponent there of saying he's an elite, but I believe those who hold on to this view that the poor doesn't know what to do with their money is being elitist and snobbish.
All right, Mr. Arjune, I hear your arguments. So now it's 8:30, so now I'm going to take this opportunity to interject myself in the discussion of itself, moving out from my moderator gear.
I have to respond to Mr. Derrick a couple of minutes. So you can either give me before or after, it doesn't matter. But I want to
go quickly, Dhanraj. Go quickly, Dhanraj.
So here's the first thing. There's a lot to unpack what Mr. Derrick said here, and I think he has grossly mischaracterized the literature. First and foremost, as of recent as of March this year, the lead development economist at the World Bank, Mr. Derrick Arjune, he issued a blog post right on the World Bank website, and he made it categorically clear that the discussion and the literature on the impact of cash transfer is by no way settled. So that's one. So him saying that, claiming that the literature and the evidence stacks a very clear path forward on what cash transfers are whether they're successful or not, it's completely not in support of the literature. The second thing is this. He made the point just now, which again, as I explained prior to his arrival, that the argument is that the poor people don't know how to spend their money. And so the bureaucrats and the elites probably know best, so they don't want to give the poor people. But that is, again, that's a profound misorganization of a concern. If that concern was true, then by the same logic, we should not be taxing anybody, period. Because when the government tax people, it's taking money out of their pocket and it's putting it in the treasury and claiming that we know how best to use your money. But we all know that that logic doesn't hold fruit, because at the end of the day, there is a merit for public taxation. There are things that we can do better together than we can do individually. Now, the third thing, he talked about the issue he mentioned several Latin American countries. Well, let me give you them. The program that he's referring to, Kenya, that is getting all the buzz right now, it's called Give Directly. You could have heard that from his response. Well, that program is not even evaluated as yet. It has not gone through a comprehensive evaluation. So let's hold our horses a bit on that program. Second, he talked about the Uganda study. The biggest, perhaps the most successful cash transfer program in Uganda is called the NUSAF program. But get this, the NUSAF program is significantly different than the kind of cash transfer that he's talking about. One is that it was not a program where they cut a check and give people at the end of the month. Here, what was different with that program? That program required young people who are unemployed to form themselves in groups of 20. And in the group of 20, they have to come up with entrepreneurial ideas. And based on an evaluation and a process, the groups will then get a cash transfer of $10,000 that they have to use. When they did look at the impact of that study, it did show that those people who participated in the program had higher disposable incomes. But note the difference there. The difference is that you didn't just wake up one morning and get $10,000 in your pocket, or 500. It was based on a business initiative, and the design of the program was completely different than just cutting a check and say, do whatever you want with it, or here are some basic conditions. The third thing, the second example that I want to make, the third example here is the one in Mexico. Perhaps when you asked me the question at the beginning of why I don't support the cash transfer program, the biggest problem that I see with this, especially in Guyana, is the issue of corruption. Let me give you the statistics. Program Progreso out of Mexico, when it was implemented in 1997, of every $1,000 that was put towards the program, do you know how much was spent on compliance and monitoring? 65% was spent on compliance and monitoring. That is $650 of every $1,000 was basically going towards administration. That is not all. The statistics show that another 8% went to monitoring. 65% was compliance, 8% was monitoring. Do you know how much money was actually left to give to people directly? 8%. Guess what? 4 years after the program was implemented, when researchers went and tested the program again, evaluated, at that time, only 41% of the cash that was appropriated to the program end up and get directly transferred. So what am I pointing to? I'm pointing to the fact that even a well-intentioned program like this, and talking about the poor and make this sound like the heaven of it will solve all the issues here, the program in and of itself, the corruption, the mismanagement, the leakage, the compliance issue, they absorb the biggest portion of that. So all you're doing technically is for every one person that receive a benefit, you're creating jobs for 2 more bureaucrats and persons sitting in the government office. So let me end by saying that again, I have never said that cash transfer does not work or it doesn't have merit. What I have said is that what the literature shows is that in those cases where it worked in very peculiar cases, where poverty is in the most extreme form, very extreme form. And my position is, if you want to address poverty, there are better policy suggestions to do that. That's what I'm saying. There are better policy suggestions.
If I may,
Go ahead.
I am not sure what literature my distinguished opponents is reading. He quotes the World Bank, and in fact, the World Bank has concluded that, and I quote, "It is to be noted that needs-based social assistance and family allowance programs are common in countries of the OECD." And it further says that these programs have a significant impact on helping the poor. Now, Mr. Dhanraj also refers to the program in Kenya, which, according to him, has not been evaluated. That's not what my understanding is. That program was indeed evaluated and resulted, as I said, in increase in income, assets, psychological well-being, food consumption, and female empowerment. Now, one of the reasons why some of these programs, such as Give Directly, are going to outright cash transfers is to cut out the bureaucracy that is inherent in the programs. So instead of having layers of administration and giving out money, they're giving it directly to the poor. So that is a concern. However, when Dhanraj speaks about the bad effect of corruption in Mexico, it is noteworthy to point out that when the program started, it started serving a few 100,000 people. Now it serves millions. In fact, about over 5 million in Mexico. And in the case of Brazil, about 13 million. So if your claim is that this program wasn't working because of corruption, then these governments, which have continued to use these programs, must be seeing something entirely different. And I submit to you that the programs have worked, and the conclusion is that had it not been for those programs, we would have had poverty as much as 11% more than what it is in Brazil, for instance, and in Mexico, it would have been 13%. So the programs have worked, and instead of there being a moving away from the use of cash transfers, instead what you're seeing in the world is a stronger embrace and implementation of cash transfers. But I heard you interrupting. I want us to go to Guyana when you come back.
All right, Mr. Arjun. So let me shift gear now. So I heard both of you gentlemen, and both of you have made reference to empirical evidences, studies in other parts of the world. What is missing from the debate, and not just the debate among the three of us here, the national debate? This is a national debate that is getting the attention of many other commentators and analysts alike. And what is missing from all of it is putting all of this empirical literature that we're all making reference to the context of Guyana. Now, economics is one thing. We cannot ignore this social element, that is the socio-cultural element of our society, of our country. And before I get into the social element, when we speak of this cash transfer, there are many other factors that we have to consider. We have to consider, and I'll talk about them, and I will give all of you, both of you, an opportunity to speak of them. But we have to consider, would this be sustainable in the long run? That's one. Two, would it What would be the social and economic consequences? What would be the economic consequences particularly? And three, will it really and truly alleviate poverty, or will it widen income inequality or economic disparity? Now, let me put Guyanese relevance based on historical experiences. What I mean by this social element. If you look at countries like China, China has developed to where it is through more or less a dictatorial regime or an autocratic regime. Guyana experimented with a similar strategy on the LFS border, and it didn't work. Now, why I'm saying this is because the notion of cash transfer, in principle, they're all good. Well, LFS Boredom, his economic policies were all good, but why did it fail? So let me give you an example. Today, all our politicians on both sides of the spectrum, on both sides of the equation, are talking about agriculture, and agriculture is the way to go, and we need to invest in agriculture and grow food and these sort of things. Boredom was the first guy to talk about agriculture. And he was the first guy who advocated that, look, we need to push agriculture, and this is why he banned so many things that coming in from the country. And one of the reasons I could recall from hearing stories from others why he banned potato, for example, was an entire container of potato came into the country, and he banned it because he felt that it was disrespect from these countries sending this sort of product here when we could grow our own food. So he banned it so that the people could grow our own food and eat what we grow. Unfortunately, the people did not respond the way he expected, and that is because of the history they came from. They came from colonialism. Our foreparents, our ancestors came from colonialism, from slavery, from indentureship, and during those days, it was the whole social construct was different. The people in China, however, and Singapore, they did not resist policies administered by the policymakers, by the politicians. They trusted it, and they lived by it, they embraced it. That did not happen, and that's why it failed. All right? The risk in Guyana context, no study was done, so there is no empirical literature to support that a cash transfer to this extent would work when we take the social elements. And I'll give you an example. Years ago, under the previous administration, and this is evidence, we know that in Linden gets, because it's a bauxite community, it has benefited from electricity subsidy for many years. And a couple of years ago, the previous government wanted to remove that subsidy. And you know what happened? People died. There was violence. So we have to think of it. Let's use the engineer of this whole cash transfer, and let's use his figure that he proposed. All right? Dr. Clive Thomas proposed 5,000 US. First of all, 5,000 US cash transfer, which is for 210,000 households, would not be feasible for the first 10 years of oil. That's one thing. Let's assume that we're going to proceed with 5,000 cash transfer every year, 10 years thereafter. 10 years thereafter, now 20 years down the line, let's say it is no longer feasible. So the government has to stop it. You would create effectively a culture of dependency, and the fear is, the social risk is, it would be extremely problematic. We are making references to other countries. We need to make reference to experiences in our own context, in our own country. Those comparative analyses that we're making to World Bank studies are absolutely not relevant to Guyana when you understand our people. I'll give you another example of a social element. There is a financial institution I used to work with, experimented with a loan model, a loan product designed to fit the needs of single mothers. All right? Now, this program was for 250,000 unsecured. Now, it's in intent, in spirit, it's nice, fantastic, come. And it was in partnership with the government. And you know what? It failed miserably. You know why it failed miserably? I'll tell you why. The model that the institution adopted was from a model from a Grameen bank called a bank by the name of the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh. And the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh was founded by the founder whose name was Grameen, a professor in Bangladesh. And this bank was designed specially to cater for poverty. Now, when you look at it comparative, people, what is extreme poverty in Bangladesh is completely different from what is extreme poverty in Guyana. Now, here how it was administered. It was administered not by across the country entirely. It was administered by communities, and even beggars could have gotten loan to buy umbrella and to buy shoes so that they could proceed, they could do their trade more comfortably to improve eventually. And the way they administered the loans, you didn't have loan officers sitting around in AC offices. The loan officers were out in the fields working with the people, monitoring, and then and they lent to pools, the community, not to a single person. So this is how they manage it, and this is how it was successful. Now the culture of the people was also different. So that's how the model worked, and that they didn't take the entire model. All right, they just take people come in, and yeah, you qualify, we give it a 250 unsecure. So here the problem with Guyana now. I studied our financial sector, and I can tell you this. Pre-1992, all right, pre-1992, the culture of the people in Guyana was such that you give a man get a mortgage with the bank, he is so consumed with pride that he's afraid that if he can't pay his loan, the bank would he lose his property. That's a huge embarrassment. So what people used to do then, if they got eat one meal a week, whatever sacrifice they need to make, they do it to pay the mortgage, to save embarrassment, and to save their property. That was the culture. Post 1992 to today, there is a complete paradigm shift in the socio-cultural construct of the market, wherein people no longer have pride. People, if people take loan from the bank, and the banks sold their property, they celebrate. Oh, I just robbed the bank. People are not even disciplined. They owe the bank money, and they travel, they party, they jump on the plane, they run up the credit card bill, they're not paying. So we're ignoring the social element from the whole argument, and this is what we have to consider. All right, I'm going to allow you guys 5 minutes each to comment on what I just said.
Mr. Derrick, you can go on.
Well, I am happy to hear that you are directing our attention to Guyana. That is where I believe we should be looking at. We should use these comparative studies as guides, as references, but ultimately we have to look at the conditions within Guyana to determine whether cash transfers should be used. And as I've stated rather clearly, they could be useful and they will be useful. Now, with regard to a specific amount, that will have to be dependent on the available resources and the target groups. But given the extent of poverty in Guyana, perhaps most of the population will be entitled to some type of cash allowance. With respect to sustainability, I am not proposing, and I don't know who is, proposing long-term cash transfers. We have to give money so that people are able to live and live in a comfortable way. I don't mean meeting all their wants, I mean meeting their basic needs such as food, housing, clothing, transportation, and health. So we give money to assist persons in those categories. We give that money as long as it is possible for them to pull themselves out of those dire circumstances. It would be irresponsible to say that we're going to continue to give this irrespective of what resources we have and the conditions of the people. We have to look at how the transfers have helped our people. We have to look at how they're achieving our goals of making Guyanese live a life that is consistent with a good life. Those things we have to look at. Now, when you point out about cultural constraints, such as slavery and indentureship and the whole colonial experience, those are realistic considerations. But you know, our people from 1966 to now have been rather resourceful in living. They have traded, they've planted, they've done whatever is necessary to live and to bring along their families. So we're not irresponsible, reckless people. Your reference to people getting mortgages and now not paying them and almost celebrating the fact that they're robbing the bank, I find that to be unsupported by my interactions with Guyanese, and I have not seen any evidence in the financial papers supporting the conclusion that Guyanese are...
That's from my experience. I
maybe
spent 10 years in
personal
the
experience.
industry.
I don't know if Guyanese willy-nilly ignoring their financial obligations. I know them to be responsible people. And most importantly, this conversation about cash transfers has taken place at the top. The academics, the politicians, the experts. And I'm not saying that...
All right, I want to give you 1 minute to wrap up because we have about 7 minutes remaining.
Okay, well, quickly. One of the important steps in this whole conversation is that we have to involve the people. I have said that we need some national consultation on what we do with our money. This is not your money, my money, belongs to the people. We have to find a mechanism to involve Guyanese, whether it's at the village, the city, the regional or the national level, in how we use our money. We talk about being a democracy. This is an opportunity to bring real democracy to Guyana by having our people, through some mechanism, to say how our money from oil should be spent.
So let me jump in here quickly because I want to make a couple of things and I know we're pressed for time. But before I respond to the issue, Mr. Derrick raised a point earlier where he rebutted to me and talked about the amount of people the Mexico program was serving at the beginning, and by now it's serving millions of people. Well, here is what Mr. Derrick also forgot to tell you, that when you're talking about a country with 129 million people, 5 million people is less than 1%. So if we take that same less than 1% and calculate it for Guyana population, we're basically talking about 30,000 people. So if we want to have a conversation about cash transfer for 30,000 people, the poorest people in society, I'm all game. Second point, Mr. Derrick made a very good point earlier, which is we have to involve the people. But here is the trick with this. It is not what the question that you ask people is what is important. Naturally, it would be foolish to think that if I go to somebody and say, would you like a cash transfer at the end of the month, yes or no? Who in their right mind would say no? But
Dhanraj, let me cut you to share some experience quickly. We got 5 minutes.
Just before you go, I'm going to finish this in 2 minutes, I promise. I went into Region 6 the other day, and I rode right up the East Bank of Berbice, all right? I stop and talk to small farmers, single mothers, small farmers, African, Indians, Amerindians. And almost here was my question to them. What is your most pressing concern that you would like your government to address? Do you know what they said to me? They said for 25 years, the East Bank Berbice Road, where thousands of truckloads, thousands of tons of production comes out every year of agriculture produce that feeds our people. The trucker sticking up on the road, tractor breaking their axle, car can't pass. The road is so bad. Every single one of them said, you know what? We don't want a handout. We're not asking people for a favor here. Fix the road so that we can fix our lives. So that's the second thing. When you talk, the question that you ask the poor, the ordinary family is important if you want an honest response. You can't set them up to say, well, do you want a cash transfer or not? Obviously, people are going to say yes. Last 2 points, I'll make it quickly. Perhaps the best way for us to talk about how much our culture and our institutions of government and whether they're well positioned to make success out of a program like this, the best way we can look is look back at history. And not so far long ago, I'm going to look back at the last 5 years. In the last 5 years, we have given, taxpayers have funded $1.3 trillion in government spendings. Where is the massive infrastructure that we have developed? Where is the infrastructure that is so badly needed in the country? Where is it? We fix a couple pieces of things, but where is it? Where is the massive modernization of our healthcare system? Where is the massive modernization of our education system? Where is the internet access that people are getting? I'm not even able to see your face clear sometimes because of the internet that you have right now. So my point is, there are better ways to deal with the cash transfer than just saying, you know, we're just going to cut people a check. People know what they want to do for their money. I think it's and the last point I'm going to make here is this. This entire discussion on cash transfer is happening at the worst possible time. Because you know why? There's an election season coming up. And nobody can, in the right mind, will tell me, because the research has shown it, that politicians are going to peddle this cash transfer strictly to gain votes. Even when the research have said, and you said it clearly, poverty in Africa and Asia is not poverty in Guyana. We have to look more carefully, and there are better ways in which we can address poverty and long-term development. So we should be talking about fixing the infrastructure. We should be talking about modernizing our economy, not about cutting a check. And after 15 years, as you rightfully said, after 10 years, even if we fund the program now, we don't have money for it after 10 years. So that doesn't change our economy.
Well, if you put it the way you put it, then certainly it wouldn't work.
All right, Mr. Arjune. So let me quickly. Hello.
Yeah, we're hearing you.
Yeah. All right. So both of you gentlemen have very, very valid arguments, but let's look at some stats. First of all, we got to understand we're talking about cash transfer in the context of poverty alleviation. What is poverty? Poverty means the inability of a group of people to generate wealth and to create wealth. What has contributed to Guyana's poverty over the years? Now here's statistics. What I'm gonna tell you. There was a labor force survey that was done in 2016 or 17 by the IDB, funded by the IDB, and you might be surprised. I don't know if Mr. Arjune, if you were privy to this report, but here's the stats from the report. Less than 5%, in fact 2.8% of the population of the labor force are educated at the level of tertiary level from bachelor's degree up. 97% of the labor force are educated at the secondary and primary level. If you look at countries like Singapore and China, the greatest resource is not oil and gold and diamond and sugar. The greatest resource that we can have is human resource, the human capital. And we have a huge human capital deficit. The highest level of the labor force at the education level is 48.3%. Altogether, 97% of the labor force are below a bachelor's degree. This explains, there was a study, I was very fortunate to examine a study that was done by a prominent Guyanese, a PhD thesis, where he studied more than 100 organizations. He was examining this whole concept of entrepreneurship. But you know what's the finding of that? The hypothesis of the thesis is that lack of entrepreneurship means employees being able to employ, demonstrate entrepreneurial behavior, which is basically driven by innovation and creativity, and that is linked to the quality of human capital. And the hypothesis is it is because of lack of this in Guyana. This is why companies are underperforming, and it also has an implication for national economic development. This is why we are largely underdeveloped. Forget about the politics, forget about politicians, forget about the political economy. If we had a high level of human capital in terms of quality, let's say if it was the reverse of this 2% and it was 97%, back 10% no schooling. I'm looking at the report now, 10% no schooling, 7% not elsewhere. If we had 97% of the population educated, high quality human capital, we could have whichever president, whichever government, this country would have been way ahead of Singapore because it is the human capital. So for me, you can't have free education and cash transfer at the same time. When we talk of free education comes at a cost. You have to train people. The risk of cash transfers, when you put it in the hands of 97% of the population who doesn't have a certain level of skill set and creativity and innovation, is that they will spend it on consumption goods. Consumption would drive up imports, and the economic consequence is hyperinflation. You don't want hyperinflation because we would be in a situation like Venezuela. You want to teach people how they could multiply their wealth in the long term. So for this, we got to talk about training and entrepreneurial training, but you can't have entrepreneurial training alone. One of the biggest constraints we're complaining about all these years is finance. We need innovative financial products. We need venture capital and microfinance institutions that when people come with a business idea, they get the requisite training and the tools. This is how venture capital firms work, and this is how microfinance institutions work. We have one microfinance institution in Ghana. It is doing extremely, extremely well. It's in terms of helping these people. So this is the kind of thing we got to look at the economic risk, which we don't want to. We have to balance it against that. If I'm to give you a quick example from experience, you ask Mr. Arjune, there is no evidence to support what I said about the bank. I work in the banking industry for more than 10 years, and I spent half of that as a loan officer giving people loans. Well, not giving people loans, advancing loans, because you got to pay it back. I work in a place in a rural, in region 1 for 3.5 years. And this was largely a gold mining industry. Now, these are gold miners. Now, this is the culture of these people, right? When you had 2013, the gold price fell. You would be surprised to see a lot of these gold miners came to me in the business of gold mining, making millions of dollars for 10 years, 15 years. And you know what? They have absolutely nothing to show for it. They come for a loan, they have no asset. You know why? Because they're spending it. From the time they reach to the landing, they're spending it out. I know of people in my circle, right in my circle, the millennials, youths, the more their income increase, the more they're spending it. They don't have money, they got to borrow because they're buying lunch every day. They're buying the new dress and makeup and all these sort of things. They're not doing anything productive with it. And that's the risk we have to guard against. We have to empower the people. In fact, our president, and I must commend our president for that, he has not endorsed the concept of cash transfer. In fact, he has endorsed the notion of empowering our people, and that's the most absolutely sensible position for him to take on this cash transfer. In the context of Guyana, our social issues, our economic issues, and we need to empower people. All right, guys, I'll give you half of a minute each to give your closing remark.
Go on, Mr. Derrick.
Well, the allegation that, and it is an allegation that people who lack education don't know how to spend the money.
That's not allegation. There are statistics to show that, Mr. Arjune. 97% of the labor force.
If I may.
So that's not allegation, that's stats.
If I may, the statistics are otherwise, that people who are poor do know how to spend their money, and bureaucrats and politicians don't know better than they do. I have it here. I have it here.
Empirical data.
But I thought I was being given the opportunity to make a closing statement. So,
no, but I want you, for the interest of the viewers, do you have such empirical data for Guyana? For the sake of the viewers.
I have data for other places, and the poor in Guyana aren't substantially different. But to claim that because they lack education, they would not be able to spend money properly, they would consume the money, is wrong. Now, you talked about investment in human capital. I absolutely agree with that. What I don't agree with is you drawing an analogy between Guyanese and Singapore, which comes from a different, which has a different history. Besides, in Guyana, you have deep poverty, and you can't talk to someone about entrepreneurial activity in a sensible way if that person can't feed a family, can't buy shoes, can't buy clothing. Please,
clothes, right?
Please. So, in order for you to talk to someone about farming and innovative ideas and creative activity, they first have to believe in themselves. They also have to have the ability to live. You also have to have an environment of hope. Guyana has not been a place imbued with hope because of our division and lack of focus. Some of the ideas that you are saying are quiet, commendable, but we have to think in the context of a country, as you said, that in which the people, 97% of them, have a certain level of education. We have to bring them up. And as we bring them up, we inculcate in them the idea of industry, the idea of entrepreneurship, the idea of innovation, the idea of creativity. And we must have a political culture that encourages individual initiative. That is somewhat lacking in our political culture. The government is still dominant. Our private sector still needs to be given more play in determining where we go.
I need to give Mr. Dhanraj some
all right, so while you have stated that we need to invest in human capital, that investment requires a basic investment in ensuring that Guyanese are able to live a life in which they have their basic needs fulfilled. And as we do that, we also build their educational level.
Definitely, and that comes with a cost. Dhanraj, quickly.
So my closing argument quickly is that is this. You see the argument that Mr. Derrick has proffered all along. He's separating the poor and basically saying, look, the elites and the government and the bureaucrats and all the educated one, don't treat the poor people like they can't make decisions. That is a classic class argument. Politicians use it all the time to create a them and us. What we're saying is very simple.
I don't deny it, sir.
There are better ways to address poverty, and I've said this before. Don't teach, you have heard this saying over and over. Don't give a man a fish, teach him to fish. People want jobs. Perhaps take the money and find a way to lower the cost of energy and let the private sector really start to create some jobs and employ people. That's a long-term solution. So my position is this. You can take a little bit of the money, and by the way, all this conversation, we didn't talk about where the money coming from that we're spending all of this time talking about, by the way. But whatever the money is coming from, if it's on an airlift, take a little bit of it, give it to the elderly, give it to the people who are disabled or differently able to be politically correct, and give it to those extremely poor, where, as Mr. Derrick rightfully said, they can't afford 2 meals a day. I'm okay with that. But the rest of the country, we have to have a better policy and strategy now to move the country forward. And I'm saying invest the money in education, invest it in healthcare, invest it in infrastructure, invest it in ICT where people can have access and connectivity to the 21st century. Those are the components that builds human capital. That's what the research is saying. There is where we should be putting our effort. So there you have it. That's my position on it.
Thank you, Dhanraj. Thank you, Mr. Arjune. I think we might have to have a part 2 to land this discussion on some grounding solutions to these issues. And very good argument. Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure to be on the panel with my colleague and friend here, Derrick. It's a pleasure.
The same here. I've been reading your posts on Globespan. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Have a good night.
All right, good. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Just before we go, we would like to announce the poll that we have run. The question that we asked our online audience was, do you believe cash transfer is a good option? 19% said yes, and 81% has responded no. Thank you.
There you go. There the people spoke.
I want.
Good night, gentlemen.
Good night.
Go ahead.